Poland's ambition under this government is to become the largest European army. And if Germany doesn't move more quickly in its sense, then that will in fact happen.
This is The Global Gambit. Greetings, Internet, and welcome back. I'm delighted to say that this episode is quite a special one because it is officially a one-year anniversary of The Global Gambit. So I'm having a glass of wine with that. Cheers. Had over 30,000 downloads, had a listenership of 50 different countries around the world, and a plethora of different guests, including my special guest today, Professor Dan Hamilton. Professor Hamilton is an esteemed expert on transatlantic relations, European affairs, and is part of the Johns Hopkins Foreign Policy Institute as a senior fellow. And we've been lucky enough to have him on before, and I think it's quite timely that, Professor, you're joining us. Okay, so one thing I do want to ask you is also about, you said, the changing balance of power. People should keep watching till that point. But, one country that is really pushing this shift in the sort of balance of power, center of gravities, is Poland. I think the Polish leader's comments about, well, his response to France, for a start, of which I know you're not a fan of Macron's approach. One, how much do you think that Poland really could become another cornerstone of or is already European security and defense posturing or whatever? But second, also, is it really going to be a replacement for this Franco-German axis?
Well, Poland clearly has become a very, very significant player because of the aggression against Ukraine. Yeah, Rzeszów in Poland is the main hub, logistics hub, and transport, jump off point for all of the support that NATO is providing to Ukraine. The Poles are taking in massive numbers of Ukrainian refugees, as are the Baltic states. They're really doing, on a per capita basis, an amazing amount to support Ukraine. They, of course, got hit by the notion that they helped the Ukrainians by not putting tariffs on their grain and so on. So their farmers, of course, got upset about that. Mm-hmm. That's been the latest development. But the European Union has sort of figured out a way to compensate those farmers while still allowing the Ukrainian grain to flow. So it also shows that Poland worked with the EU, despite the emotions involved, that they've been able to sort that out. Poland's ambition under this government is to become the largest European army. And it is on track to do that.
What is that, by total number of troops? Or
yes. Wow. And if Germany doesn't move more quickly in its sense, then that will in fact happen. And as I say, if you think about the NATO strategy now of moving to deterrence by denial, that means many more troops in Poland. The way that NATO has dealt with that issue in the past with Russia is the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which was signed in the 1990s, in which NATO said under current circumstances, it saw no need to position any troops permanently on the territory of these at that time, new member states. So many are arguing now that that premise is gone, and maybe there is a need. NATO's been careful to have rotating troops go into Poland, not permanent presence, but it's heel to toe. As soon as one group leaves, the other arrives. So it's somewhat of a fiction. But if NATO would move to a permanent basing strategies through Eastern Europe, that would be a major change. And that's something to look forward to at the Vilnius summit coming up in July, NATO summit, in which that's one of the questions. Should NATO suspend the NATO-Russia Founding Act because of Putin's aggression, and then say we do see real reason to have permanent stationing? You also see the infrastructure has to be built in all those countries, including the Baltic states, to accommodate these troops. So that's another thing that's developing. And one shouldn't forget Southeastern Europe, because the same discussion is happening in Romania and Bulgaria. The Black Sea is part of the Russian-Ukraine war, and we have NATO allies on the Black Sea. So there's also the issue you have to defend all of NATO territory, not just Northeastern Europe. Southeastern Europe feels under threat as well.
I was just wondering if you could unpack a little bit that some of those latest developments around the grain deal, given that, Russia's threatened, I don't know how many times at this point, that they're going to pull out, that it won't be sustained. And also because before Ukraine, the Polish dynamics in the EU were obviously, along with Hungary, one of the most problematic. And yet, Poland's become, as you say, the forefront of defense in the European Union lines, NATO lines in many ways. How do you see those dynamics playing out going further forwards?
One way I would think about the grain deal and some of the other challenges that we're facing with Ukraine is Russia is weaponizing the flows of people, goods, food, everything you can think about that sustain Ukrainian life. Mm-hmm. They're not just attacking Ukraine on the battlefield, they're attacking all of Ukrainian society. They're bombing hospitals, schools, apartments. They're trying to cut off the infrastructure. They threaten, to blow up the dams. The real risk here is that the Ukrainians might gain something on the battlefield, but those gains could be erased by losses off the battlefield if we don't help Ukraine be as resilient as it can throughout its society to these kind of disruptive attacks. So the grain is just one example of how Putin can manipulate flows to his own advantage. It's a lever in which it's a lever of disruption. He can turn it on, turn it off, threaten it. It just creates more uncertainty all the time. I think he's limited a bit in that leverage because of Russia's narrative vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Because the grain flows not mainly to the European Union, it flows to many countries in the South. Many countries face hunger, disastrous situation if they don't get both Russian or Ukrainian grain through the Black Sea. So, and the Russians know that. Their own narrative is damaged if they are seen as the ones that stop the grain flowing to developing countries. So, yes, he's playing with it, but I think it's limited in how he can do it, especially if there's pushback. So the European Union on its side said, well, we want to help the Ukrainians as much as we can. So we lift all our restrictions, tariffs, everything on Ukrainian goods and exports to us so we can help the Ukrainians. But in the food area, this has been now particularly problematic because it has been undermining the farmers, not only in Poland, but in lots of neighboring countries. So they were on strike. They were, threatening all sorts of things. And I think the EU finally stepped in and said, we still have to help the Ukrainians, but we can compensate you in other ways. There are mechanisms within the EU to compensate on agricultural pricing and things like that. And that's sort of the compromise that they're reaching. But your other question was more about the internal dynamics in Poland, political dynamics, until Putin invaded again in last year, the EU was focused more on the internal dynamics in Poland and the issues it had with the governing party, changed the nature of the judicial system in Poland. And that violated, in the eyes of the EU, any number of EU rules. And it threatened to withhold its support for the post-COVID funding and also the structural funds to Poland. Poland's among the largest, if not the largest, recipient of structural funds from the EU budget and agricultural funds. So it's been a dance. Hungary's been part of that, but Hungary has also been a skeptic on Ukraine, and so I think Hungary is more in the doghouse, if you will, than Poland these days because Poland has stepped up in so many other ways. And Poland is facing elections. Perhaps next to the elections in Turkey this month, the most critical elections in Europe will be in Poland in the fall. And so the Law and Justice Party, the ruling party right now, probably can't get a majority. It'll have to have a coalition. And the opposition parties are trying to discuss how they could, replace the conservative government with a new, more progressive, if they would call it, government. Donald Tusk, the former president of the European Union, is now returned to Poland to lead the major opposition party. He's trying to get all the opposition parties to unite behind him, basically. They're all jockeying for power, so that hasn't yet come to pass. But it'll be arithmetic in the end in the election in Poland, who gets the high hand and who gets the ability to try to form a new government. So much of what you see in Poland these days, one should look at in the context of, the lead up to the election. That's really what's driving a lot of the politicians at the moment.
What do you think about the Finnish elections and how that could impact Finland's approach to NATO, but also the border with Russia?
So the Finnish elections were really about local issues, and they were particularly about economic issues. It didn't really turn on the NATO issue, where there is now a robust consensus in Finland to not only join NATO, they're actually now a NATO member. So I think you'll see a very strong consensus going forward. The Finns are quite determined now to be a full-fledged ally and to double down on their defensive efforts, which have in their history actually always been quite impressive. Finland shared a border with Russia for a long time, of course, and has had some wars with Russia. It knows, how to work with Russia, I believe, and they have interesting traditions in Finland of sort of total defense ideas. Their idea of neutrality, was not to just sort of, not to be a straddle the fence. It was to arm themselves so they could defend their country on their own if they had to. So they have a very strong historical tradition of defense that reaches deep into their society. They can mobilize hundreds of thousands of people quickly, faster than almost any European country. So they bring those notions of total defense, societal security into the alliance at a time when those are issues that are really in high demand. So I think you'll see the new government being very pragmatic and moving ahead and being the best ally it can be.
What about this potential coalition that's being pursued potentially? The Finnish party, I believe it's literally called the Finns Party, is considered far right. Now, I'm not expecting there to be a significant shift away from obviously supporting Ukraine, European defense, but given that this is a nationalistic entity, could that be a bit of a problem for European Eastern border defense? The Russians have said that they would respond heavy-handedly if the Finns did join NATO. But let's be realistic. In what way can the Russians really sustain a very heavy military presence along one of the longest borders without significant shifts away from other major theaters? So,
well, as I said, much of the coalition building has to do more with domestic politics, not really foreign policy issues. So, as I said, there's a broad consensus across Finnish society now about NATO and about the kind of threat now Russia is posing, not just to Finland, but to all of Europe. So I don't believe a coalition of the kind you mentioned is going to affect that piece. Where it will have some impact is on how the Finns debate their own domestic, political life. And you have a very far right or potentially conservative party, part of a coalition. It will, of course, argue for tough policies, that it believes in. So you can see some restrictions on flows of people. You can see some questioning about social welfare issues. That ties into the debate the Finns were having about their economy, which is why the Social Democrats lost, because the more moderates were saying, the Finns are very conscious about debt. They're very conservative in terms of their fiscal responsibilities. And that, I think, is what really turned the election. So one more very conservative party in a coalition will just, enhance that view. But the prime minister is a well-known figure, is sort of a mainstay of Finnish politics, not seen as a far-right figure at all or anything eccentric. People call him the steady hand. So I think you'll see sort of just really from a foreign perspective, just continuity.
Do you think that the continuity, but we have seen a shift away from a pretty, I don't know, she was one of the youngest leaders. I don't want to fall into that trap of being like, how do you deal with being a female leader? And that great response, I think it was with her Kiwi counterpart, that they were like, it doesn't matter if we're women, but we're going back to a more conventional sort of center right composition. You just don't see it being particularly significant. What about in their relations to the Baltic? Do you think the Finns are looking at this generally as more cooperation with the 3 Seas initiative, for example? Or
well, absolutely. If you think about Finland joining NATO and potentially Sweden, which is still to come, but I do anticipate Sweden will join the alliance. It's really changing the whole security geography, if you will, of the high north, of the northern part of Europe. Not only is the Baltic Sea then essentially a NATO lake with parts of mainland Russia and its exclave of Kaliningrad. Otherwise, it's all NATO countries. So that transforms the security dynamics. Also, how NATO countries can help the Baltic states, but because before you had Sweden and Finland sort of straddling the Baltic states, it was hard for NATO forces to reinforce from the north, and they were locked into this difficult issue of what's called the Suwalki gaps, or this this small piece of land between Poland and Lithuania, straddled by Belarus and Russia on each side. And that was the only way to get to the Baltic states, through NATO territory. Now, that's changed fundamentally. So it requires a whole new maritime strategy. There will be a different air defense strategy, and of course, a different land defense strategy. And NATO is moving away from its old notion of deterrence by tripwire forces. And the idea was that if aggressor came and took territory, you would have to sacrifice some troops, but the reinforcements would come. And of course, the Baltic states say, well, if that happens, we'll be wiped off the map before the reinforcements show up. So NATO has moved now, or is moving, to a deterrence by denial approach. That is, that's what leaders mean when they say we'll defend every inch of NATO territory. That means you stop the aggressor right at the border, which means a whole different posture. And that means a lot more troops in the Baltic states and Poland, a very different Finnish approach to NATO. The island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea is going to become a major defense installation now for NATO, probably as soon as Sweden joins NATO. So it's a transformative notion that Vladimir Putin has done the one thing he didn't want to do, which is unite the West like he'd never done. Now he got a bigger NATO to contend with. Not
Master strategist he is. Well, thank you very much, Professor, for this brief but I think very in-depth conversation. I really appreciate the time, and I look forward to having you back on the channel in the near future. Do a deeper dive with you on Germany as well. Otherwise, everyone, if you enjoyed the conversation, please like, subscribe, share it around, and I'll see you on the next episode of The Global Gambit. Take care, everyone.